Hey friends, how's it going? This is we haven't done a podcast in a little while. It's been a kind of busy time, but I'm beginning to work on the next season of the Voyagers podcast, and so we've had some opportunities to start talking to a few people and do some interviews, and we got the incredible pleasure of talking with the author of the new book Sacred Earth, Sacred Soul, and this is a book about Celtic Christianity or Celtic spirituality by John Philip Newell, who is an incredible spiritual teacher. He was a mentor for Seth and his spiritual path, and I think you guys are really going to enjoy the conversation that Seth and I had with him, talking about his new book, talking about his path and some of the developments in his life, and just the chance to sit at the feet of an incredibly wise and humble man was just it was an incredible pleasure. So just want to, you guys, please enjoy this conversation. Love to share this one, please, with people, share it with others if they need to hear it. But both Seth and I just kind of chewed on this conversation, and it was like a massage for the soul. So I think you'll really enjoy it. Beautiful day here on Maui. It's awesome time of year. The temperatures are slowly starting to come down a little bit, so it's just kind of beautiful and lovely. And yeah, so anyway, enjoy this conversation, and then we'll see you on the next podcast. I'd like to just get into some kind of simple questions. I mean, in general, in terms of the book, Sacred Earth, Sacred Soul, which, by the way, kind of just blew my mind. It's a general kind of overview of Celtic Christianity. You know, a lot of your past work has been, kind of focused on Celtic Christianity, but for our audience, can you kind of give us just a small summary, or not a small summary, but as summarized as you can regarding Celtic Christianity and how you were introduced to it and where you started?
Yes. I first became aware of this stream of wisdom in our Christian household, and it's a stream that we now refer to as Celtic spirituality, but that is a fairly modern term. But we use it to refer to this consistency of vision that begins as early as the 2nd century in Gaul, in the Celtic world of Gaul, and can be traced right through the centuries to today. Major prophetic figures continuing to give voice to a vision of the earth as essentially sacred, and also speaking of that which is deepest in every human being as of God, divine, sacred.
Yeah, that clash. One of the things in the book that really just kept coming out to me, obviously, as someone myself who grew up in a Pentecostal kind of evangelical Christian background, the clash in theological, that turning of the nature of a human being sacred versus the nature of the human being opposed to God and being sinful. That seemed to be like the resounding theme throughout the book as we're walking through history with these different leaders and thought leaders in Celtic Christianity. I'm still kind of hit with a sadness about when that clash kind of essentially when the sinful theology won out.
Yeah.
I found myself grieving a bit about the damage that it seems that has been done by that.
Yes.
Do you feel like it's part of your mission to kind of try and heal that?
Yes, absolutely. And I think it's a good and important thing, David, to grieve. I think that there's a lot about our Western Christian history and inheritance that it's important to name and grieve. And much of it is related to this early doctrine that came to be referred to as the doctrine of original sin, in which it was taught that what is deepest in us is opposed to God rather than being of God. And that has enormous implications for how we see ourselves, how we treat the other, and especially the so-called other, the one on the other side of a religious division or a nationhood division or race or sexual orientation division. And it has had enormous consequences in terms of how we view ourselves, but also our relationships with one another. And part of what I explore in the book is that deep within our Celtic treasure as Christians is this inheritance of a radically different way of seeing. And that is, it's not a naive perspective. It's not pretending or suggesting that we are not in need of mercy and grace. One of the earliest expressions of this tension between Celtic wisdom and the teachings of what became imperial Christianity. One of the first tensions or debates happened in the 4th century between Pelagius, a monk from the Celtic world, and the great sort of teacher of the 4th century in imperial Christianity, St. Augustine of Hippo. And it's interesting to look at that debate because the misunderstanding of the Celtic just keeps happening over the centuries. Mm-hmm. So Augustine hears Pelagius say that what is deepest in every person is of God, that what is deepest in you, what is deepest in me is sacred. And he interprets that to mean, if that's the case, then you must be saying that we don't need grace. Yeah, right. And he sets up this opposition or tension between nature and grace. And when we actually get into Pelagius's teachings, and when we look at all the great teachers in this stream, it's very clear that all of them are saying that we need both nature and grace. That is, our nature is essentially of God, it's sacred, but we've become disconnected from that divine nature of the image of God within us. And grace is given not in opposition to our nature, but rather grace is given to reconnect us with our nature. Grace is not given that we might become something other than ourselves or somehow more than natural, but it's given that we might become truly natural, that we may truly fly with the creativity, the beauty, the wisdom of the divine that is at the very core of our being.
Yeah. I have, oh, go ahead, Seth, you have a question?
Yeah, I do. And I always have, I have many questions I wanted to ask you over the years. And when I attended the Celtic Schools of Consciousness, it's fascinating to watch, to watch you balance the desires of everyone to talk to you, and at the same time, your desire to have those conversations and how you have to maintain your own space and everything. It's always fascinating. I learned a lot by watching that. But I have a question for you that came up when I was on Iona way back in the day. I think it was in 2013 or something like that. And I followed you around a lot, I asking you all kinds of difficult questions. But there was a minister in our group that, remember, we had the group from my school, and then we had a lot of kind of former ministers, and there was a guy who he was a Universalist Unitarian minister. And at the time, when I came to Iona, I was wrestling with my atonement theory. I was in that space where I was in a deconstructing space. And right in that space, I was like asking that big question that so many people that deconstruct ask. And Celtic Christianity, the only reason I still even carry the label of Christian is because of my experience on Iona. and I was asking you questions about this, but when we would have these times in the pub, I remember there was a point where a bunch of us were around this Unitarian Universalist minister, and the question that kept coming up towards him was, but what's the point? What's the point of a church? What's the point of a gathering? What's the point of a building? What's the point of a community? And I realized that none of us understood a relationship with God without that sacrificial kind of transactionary relationship. And what you're articulating in these books and what these saints were articulating was a Christianity that isn't a transaction, and yet it's still a church. And so I'm prefacing this question because I'd like to hear about, if you're okay with talking about your personal experience of giving up your ordination in the Church of Scotland. And because especially the chapter about Alexander John Scott, I just saw a parallel between what you're experiencing and what he experienced. And so I'm very curious about what's the point, through this lens, through this lens of this theology, like, what's the point of church? What's the point of building? What's the point of community? Why is this a thing, and what does that look like in this vision? Does that make sense?
That's a great and vast question.
I was going to ask that too.
Typically, but one of my favorite teachers in this stream, and I give chapter 3 to him, is John Scott of Reawakening, the 9th century Irish teacher. And one of the things that Reawakening says is that we, and by that he means humanity, we suffer from soul forgetfulness. That is, we have forgotten who we are. And the more we forget who we are, made of God, the more we forget that what is deepest in us is sacred, and what is deepest in the other is sacred. The more we treat one another as other than sacred, and the more and more we don't access those sacred resources of the divine deep within us and deep within one another. So Reawakening speaks about us suffering from soul forgetfulness. And it's in that context that he speaks of Christ as our memory. That is, he sees Christ as coming to restore an awareness in us of our true essence, of our true depth. He speaks of Christ also as our epiphany, or as our revelation. And the word revelation comes from the Latin root revelare, which is to lift the veil. So he sees Christ as coming not to reveal or disclose a foreign truth, or to disclose something that is foreign to us, but rather is coming to disclose to us what is at the very heart of our being. So it's an intimate truth, it's a personal truth that Christ is revealing. And I see that as the sort of central, I mean, the Christ figure is the central figure in our Christian inheritance. I think he can call us to our own Christhood, to know that essence, that core of our being is made of God. And I think that everything that we do within the community of the church, whether it is in our relationships with one another, whether it is in our prayers, in our rituals, in our pilgrimages, in our spiritual disciplines, I believe it's all to do with a remembering and a reaccessing of those true depths of our being. And practices around repentance and forgiveness are also about getting in touch again, turning around again to be reconnected to what is first, and in that sense most original in us. So we find in someone like Pelagius, again, one of the first teachers in this stream, one of the spiritual practices that he's passionate about, and he's the first historically to mention it, is the importance of the Anam Cara relationship, the importance of having a lover of the soul or a friend of the soul. And he says about our relationship with our Anam Cara, and of course one can have many Anam Caras, or the community of faith that one belongs to can be seen as a type of community of Anam Cara relationship. But he says that we are to show everything to our Anam Cara, and we're to hide nothing. And he is not thereby meaning that my Anam Cara, that the person who is the lover of my soul, or the people who are the lovers of my soul, it's not to say that they know more of what is within me than I do, but in the very act of me trying to disclose, trying to give expression to the stirrings that are in my soul, it's in the act of trying to express what is within me that I come into a greater consciousness of my depths, and that is also a really important process, I believe, in moving towards acting in relation to what my true essence is. So that I think, in my relationship with you, Seth, for instance, if I'm giving expression to the yearnings within me for living compassionately, for seeing the other as I see myself, as living out of that truth, so that I'm speaking a compassion that's not just looking after my family, but the family down the street, or it's not just looking after my nation, but it's looking after the well-being of another nation, or not just looking after the well-being of the human species, but looking after the interrelated well-being of all species. If I can express some of those yearnings of the divine from within me, if I do that in my relationship, if in your presence, because I sense that you love me and trust me, I give expression to that, then I'm much more likely to be enabled to live that vision and live that truth. So that is what I see as the sort of overarching vision of the place of Christ in our Christian inheritance, and the place of ritual, the place of community, the place of prayer and spiritual practice. Is about constantly remembering what it is to be made of God.
Yeah. You mind if I ask another one, Dave?
I've go. Yeah, it's
Yeah,
good stuff.
I have a I enjoy to when it comes to theology. Celtic theology is an absolutely beautiful stream, and discovering that ancient way of understanding, discovering, you use terms like pre-Christian a lot, and I think that there is a, in the world today, there's, especially like here in the West, like in America, we have there's a perspective that I think a lot of people that are Christians believe that what they believe is Christianity. They go, well, this is Christianity, not recognizing just how young the theological streams are that they're coming from. And so to discover something that goes, that predates the Roman Church, that predates Constantine and that entire experience is very, very life-giving. And I remember in my interactions with you had this desire to bring this to the millennial generation, to the younger generation. Because when I would attend the Celtic schools of consciousness, it was a lot of older people, a lot of people in their 60s, 70s, 80s. And I'm curious about when it comes to what this has to say and how to bring this to a younger audience. I'm curious about your insights over just the last 10 years, like how that's gone, like how is it going in coming to, because I see a stream, you talk about it in the book, a stream of people leaving the church, younger people searching for something deep. Are you seeing a resonance with that ancient stream in this newer generation now?
Yes, I think that we're living in a time of great spiritual change. I think that the religion as we know it is collapsing all around us. I mean, I think one only has to look around on a Sunday morning in most of our traditional Christian churches to realize that in another 25 years, it will simply not be as we've known it. So an enormous collapse is happening. I think what's exciting about this moment is to look at what are the yearnings that have led many of us to be dissatisfied with our traditional Western Christian inheritance. I'm working on my next sort of major piece of writing now, and it's all about the spiritual exile that many people are in the midst of, and I'm telling the story, or looking at that big story of spiritual exile, in part through my own journey. And part of that journey over the last year has been the decision to relinquish my ordination as a Church of Scotland minister, in the realization that the Church of Scotland's statements of faith, um, which are rooted in the Nicene Creed and the Apostles' Creed, which were expressed in the 3rd and 4th centuries when Christianity was getting into bed with empire and was becoming imperial religion. So important historical creeds like the Nicene and the Apostles' Creed that the Church of Scotland stands by, but also its 16th century Reformation creeds. I realized that there's nothing in those statements of faith that actually reflect or give utterance to what is most dear to me around the sacredness of the earth and the sacredness of every human being. So it was important as an act of integrity to no longer fly under that banner. Why was I calling myself a reverend of the Church of Scotland when in fact my own church was not giving expression formally to what is most important to me? And I think that in this time of change, there are some who are definitely looking beyond the four walls of the church to find vision and to find spiritual practice and community to move forward. There are others who are still staying within the church as we've known it, but who are hungry and who are longing, but they're also knowing a sense of indebtedness to our Christian history. And I understand that, and I think I'm part of that, wanting to be grateful for much of what we've received. And then there are people in my the generation of my children, for instance, who simply don't see their spiritual journey at all in relation to what traditional Christianity has been. They're following some of their deep instincts and yearnings to develop a spiritual vision and spiritual practice that more deeply connects them to the sacredness of the earth and to care of the earth, and spiritual vision and spiritual practices that free them to deeply honor the wisdom of other traditions and the meditative practices of many great spiritual traditions from the East, for instance. So their assessment of what is to be sought relates to some of their essential vision and sense of relationship with the sacredness of the earth and of every human being. So on that spectrum, we're in this time of enormous change. And part of what I think we need to focus on is the kernel, as it were, of the yearnings that have either taken us outside the church or are taking us well beyond the bounds of Western Christianity as we've known them. Mm-hmm. And my fascination with this time of spiritual exile has led me to get in touch a bit more with the word diaspora or diaspora. We sometimes speak of this sort of diaspora of our Christian brothers and sisters who began life within the church, but aren't many of them are now sort of outside the walls of Christianity as we've understood them and defined them. But the word diaspora, although we have used it, of the Jewish people, or we've used it of the African American diaspora that resulted from the slave trade, or we speak of the Celtic diaspora of people who were scattered from Scotland during the Highland clearances and the Irish potato famine and so on. Although we often use the word diaspora or diaspora to refer to those in exile, the word itself means a scattering of seed. It's spora, seed, scattered throughout. So I see these yearnings as like seeds that we are carrying, and the exciting thing for me is to pay attention to what these seeds of yearning are giving rise to in our spiritual practices, in our I mean, something like the Church of the Wild, I think, is a really interesting expression of the desire to connect spirituality with a reverence for the earth, for instance.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to throw a curveball at you here, okay? I am curious, using your book.
They don't have curveballs there.
Oh, they have. You can throw in.
Can you do a curveball in cricket? I don't think you can. No, you can. Sure.
I'm sufficiently mid-Atlantic to understand that.
I see your book as it's a Christology, essentially as a hermeneutical lens for understanding so much of what's happening in the world. And I'm curious, just current event, what's happening in Afghanistan. The way Afghanistan seems almost as a geographical space, seems to always want to pull itself back to a very archaic form of relationship with God and Islam. I'm very curious.
Hey, Seth, hold on, back up. Something's going on with your mic, I think.
I always have.
There we go. That's better. Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead and just do your question.
So, using Celtic Christianity, using your book even as a hermeneutical lens, in a sense, I'm curious what your perspective is on Afghanistan and how that space seems to always want to pull itself back to a very primitive, very archaic relationship with the divine and with God and with Islam itself. And so, I mean, we're talking about Christianity and the diaspora of Christians that are being scattered in this way. I'm curious, like, do you see this same thing in the Islamic world, and how do you understand, like, I think everyone here is kind of going, but why is there not a evolutionary pull forward? Why so easily does it go back to that? I mean, I can't imagine that in the West, where all of a sudden we all just go back to a sacrificial relationship with an angry God. Why is that evolution not taking place in that space, or is it? And I just can't see it.
Yeah. One of the interesting things about the Indian Islamic world, if I could sort of visit that expression of Islam in order to try to understand a bit more of what's happening in the Afghanistan context, it's interesting to observe historically that before the 19th century and before the sort of the heyday of the British Empire and the British Raj in India, the most predominant expression of Islam in India at that stage was the Sufi Muslim tradition, which is a much more mystical tradition, is an expression of that part of Islam that is looking for and is reverencing the sacredness in the earth and in every human being, and is accentuated or is characterized much more by sort of ecstatic forms of prayer and community, and about sort of releasing the energies of the divine within us, rather than a sort of religious law-based expression of Islam. Interestingly, the factor that the negative factor that affects Indian Islam in the 19th century during the time of the British Empire is a very heavy-handed form of Western Christianity, a type of rigid evangelicalism that tried to conquer Islam in India, and that Western Christianity in its British expression was like the arm of empire, as it were, so trying to force a conformity or trying to force conversion. That produced a reaction in the Islam of India. And it was in that context that some of the more extreme forms of Sunni Islam, for instance, start being expressed. So in a sense, some of those more extreme forms of Islam responsibility for creating that fundamentalist extreme reaction in many ways lies at the door of the West and Western imperialism and trying to impose its way on other parts of the world. And the horrendous chaos that we're witnessing in Afghanistan today, again, I believe responsibility for much of that lies with the West, because we have repeatedly acted like empire. And I remember years ago in Canada giving a talk in Ottawa, and the theme of my talk was very much looking at the prologue to John's Gospel, and especially the words in the prologue to John's Gospel that speak of the light, the true light that enlightens every person coming into the world. And in attendance at the talk that night was a Mohawk elder, and he had been invited to be there in part so that he could reflect for us on any of the resonances between Celtic wisdom and Native or First Nations wisdom in the Mohawk context. At the end of my talk, he stood, this strong, physically strong young Native leader, and with tears in his eyes, and he said, as I've been listening to these themes tonight, I have been wondering where I would be tonight. I've been wondering where my people would be tonight. I've been wondering where we would be as a Western world tonight if the Christianity that had come to us from Europe centuries ago had come expecting to find light in us. These words cut my heart open with truth that night, listening to him. And I see many of the conflicts and places of violence and wrong in the world as very directly related to religious expressions of Christianity that have been the arm of empire. And tragically, we've produced reaction, and instead of nurturing relationship with the beauty and the wisdom of other nations and other religious traditions.
Well, it's really well spoken. I often wonder. I mean, you can see it when people begin to cease to live in resistance to what the world around them, and they release that judgment. It's almost like a space gets created for the light within to actually grow in itself. And I wonder, possibly are we in a time where the world has evolved enough that we can finally, everyone can back up, and we can leave that space in a way, leave it alone enough that the light within Islam itself can begin to grow and flicker in that space. And what does that evolution look like there if we can all just back away, you know? And I see that even in the president's speech the other day, he's saying we've got to just, we've all needed to finally back up. When he talked about, he goes, it's the graveyard of empires, right? That there's this space that needs to, so that the flame of Islam itself can actually begin to grow in that space.
Yes. Yeah.
You know, the idea of respecting Islam as a religion is going to take a long time for Americans to get on board with. You know, it's been, from a branding standpoint, Islam has a bad brand in the United States, and it's been so toxic that all we can think of is images of the Taliban with guns, and instead of understanding that like all the other wonderful like world traditions, there is this beautiful, beautiful side to it. And that's a tough one for Americans to chew on right now. It's a really hard. I think all they see is $2.3 trillion spent and thousands of lives, and yeah, that's a tough one. That's a tough one.
Yeah, and you know, it's so instructive to also be reminded that most of the sort of non-Christian world, when they hear the word Christian or when they hear the word church, what they immediately think of is a fundamentalist Christian expression.
Absolutely.
So we are often seen through that sort of tragically distorted lens, just as so many in the West see Islam through the lens of that extreme and contorted version of it. One of the things I've been very aware of in my own journey is just how transformative it has been for me personally to be in close relationship with teachers from other traditions. And I think that the more we can do to bring our communities into personal relationship with one another, the more we will be liberated from these stereotypes of the other.
Yeah.
And you know, the same is true on many of the tragic divides in our world. It's coming to know and respect those of different sexual orientation, or it's coming to know and respect and love those of other sort of races and other nationhoods. It's these relationships that form the basis of a transformed way of seeing, because then we no longer treat the other in terms of a projection or a name or a label. We are being invited to be in relationship with the heart of their being, which is much deeper than religious, racial, sexual orientation labels.
Yeah.
Um,
do you have another question, Seth?
I do, of course. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. I'm gonna give you one more, and then I'm gonna transition into kind of some closing thought stuff. And I want to go ahead.
Okay. So the term peregrini, right? The wandering Celtic teacher in this tradition, the ancient tradition. I'm curious if, you know, I've been watching the evolution of your work. You know, from when I met you, it was kind of heading in a different direction, but you've very much gone kind of back to that. It's almost like you're returning to the heart of the Celtic tradition as a peregrini, as a wandering teacher. And I'm curious where you see the next 10 years of your life, you know, going is that what you are now? You're a peregrini?
Yeah, I suppose if I'm to accept any label or term, I'd be happy with that one. And you know, the peregrini or the wandering teacher in the Celtic stream is really pointing to a teacher or a journeyer or a voyager, to use the language of your podcast, who is not primarily traveling under the auspices of a religious tradition and sets of doctrines, but is forever looking for one's place of resurrection. I love that definition of the peregrini, that the peregrini in the historical Celtic tradition is, in a sense, setting sail to look for one's place of resurrection. Where is the place of new beginnings, the place of a greater creativity, the place of greater compassion, the place of greater wisdom, and to always do that in a sense of awareness that we are becoming. I mean, this is an aspect of the universe that I think is so exciting, and that is, it is forever unfolding. It's forever finding new form, new expression, and anything that isn't unfolding or finding new expression is finished in the universe. It's an indication that it's dying rather than continuing to live and unfold. And I think that there is that freedom in the peregrini, or the Scottish Bagans, as they were called, the wandering Scottish teachers. And I know, and I increasingly am experiencing the freedom of being a wandering teacher, forever looking for the place of new beginnings, new life, not only for myself, but for the world and for one another in relationship. Having said that, I think that there's also something quite lonely at times about the path of the peregrini, or the wandering teacher. And I know that I find myself longing for times such as we had together on Iona, Seth, and that is a taste of the community that is, I think, trying to become. So I think that many of us are really hungering for the depth and commitment that can only come with community and longer term relationship. But I think we can find these without necessarily going to the very stultified, unchanging, fixed ways and practices of a lot of our Western Christian inheritance.
Wow. Okay. So I guess I'd like to kind of, obviously, we try and keep these interviews to an hour just because I want to respect time, but also like these podcast episodes are about 35, 40 minutes. I'd really like to talk about spiritual practice. The wonderful thing about the book that just kind of I've really enjoyed was it was part history lesson. I mean, really in-depth, wonderful history about the Celtic world that I just did not have the details on. It was part, kind of an extrapolation of the wisdom that can be taken from these spaces. But then it was also part spiritual practice at the end of each chapter, kind of going through these practices of meditative, prayer. What do you do? Like, what is your spiritual practice? How do you approach your day in that way? And I mean, if you could share that with our audience, it'd be awesome.
Yeah. Yes, I'm very really delighted that you raised that question, David, because our School of Earth and Soul, which was previously known as the School of Celtic Consciousness, and we shifted from that term in part because I found that no one really, very few people knew how to spell consciousness. And I even had an email address with consciousness in it, and I mean, it eliminated most of the emails that were coming.
No, the SCI throws everybody off. You can't do it.
That's right. So we describe the School of Earth and Soul as a Celtic initiative of study, spiritual practice, and compassionate action. So for me, it's never just about study. And I mean, this new book comes out of years of study, years of sort of academic reflection, digging, and so on. So I revere, I really honor the way of study. But it's never just about study. For me, the study needs to be coupled with spiritual practice, and the combination of study or reflection and spiritual practice is one that strengthens us for the holy work of compassionate action for one another and for the world. So I always see it as a real stream. And I pay very close attention to that stream and trying to find that balance in my own life. So for me, the most pronounced spiritual practice on a daily basis is what I do first thing around the dawn. I love the dawn. I love that transition time between darkness and light, between night and day. And the Celtic world loves these sort of liminal times, and so many great traditions have loved this coming of the new light and have celebrated it as a time of meditation. So for me, when I wake up, when I come from, when I begin to move from the dream world into sort of consciously waking, I think, oh yeah, what I get to do right away today is meditate, and I have a half hour of silent prayer, and I position myself in relation to the east so that I can be more aware of the coming of light. Of course, in Scotland, the sun rises very late in the winter, so I'm well in advance of the sun rising. But in the summer, the sun is rising at about 2:00 in the morning. So I tend not to catch it then. But I literally position myself so that I can be aware of the growing light.
Yeah.
I know with absolute certainty in my life that if I ever think I don't have time for meditation this morning, I've got A, B, C to get done before noon. If I ever go down that route, it becomes very clear to me that that I'm beginning an unproductive and unintegrated day.
Yeah.
So I pay really close attention to that very simple practice of meditative prayer. And I do it on my own often. And often, of course, I'm blessed to be able to do it with others. Ali, my wife, is a great believer in that practice, so we sometimes share it. I also love these times on Iona. I mean, during our Iona pilgrimage week, the first thing we do is to gather in the 11th century chapel of Saint Michael, and we have a half hour of silent prayer, and so I love that, and that's the real bedrock for me of spiritual practice. There are lots of other spiritual practices that I'm a great believer in. We on Iona, we always have a time close to before the evening meal when we gather in one of the other ancient chapels and do a simple ritual around earth, air, fire, or water, using one of the elements as a way of opening our eyes to see the light in one another, or to recover the balance of the feminine and the masculine within us and between us. And I'm a great believer in the spiritual practice of pilgrimage. And I mean, we're living in a very exciting time when so many people are discovering again the important relationship between what we do with our bodies and how that affects our souls or our spirits. And I'm a believer in very rigorous spiritual practices. I mean, on Iona, when we have our day of walking the 9-mile route around the island, that is always the most significant day of the week in my experience. Something happens in the group, and not only within individuals, but between people. And there's something good about pushing one's body beyond sort of the comfortable level. I think it's not about sort of beating the body up or sort of pushing ourselves too much, but I think that there's a beautiful relationship between the commitment to try to push oneself physically on pilgrimage and the awarenesses and the inner blessings that can come through that prayerful discipline.
Do you ever, when you miss like a day or two of meditation, do you start to kind of feel that whole and just go, I need to get back there?
Well, I mean, the reality, David, is that I don't miss it.
That's awesome.
I simply do not miss meditation now, and that's not to be boastful about myself. That's just to say, I know so well that the day goes downhill if I neglect meditation.
Well said. Well said.
Well, the other spiritual practice that I'd like to point to, because many people know me in relation to this, and it's sort of a bit of fun, but it's not just fun; it's pretty serious. And that is, I practice siesta, and I see letting go, early in the afternoon, and lying down and reminding myself that it's not all about what I do, and it's not all about sort of my energy and relentless pushing on to achieve. It's important to let go, and I have this at this time of year. I have a hammock in the garden here in Edinburgh, and I feel reborn. I mean, I experience resurrection every afternoon.
That's so awesome.
And so
That's
I
awesome.
describe myself as a siesta fundamentalist.
Hey, no, I really, I'm on board with that, because here in Hawaii has a very, because we're near the equator, has very, very steady rhythms. I moved from Anchorage, Alaska, 4.5 years ago, which is actually further north in Scotland than in Edinburgh. And so the light, and there's no rhythm, right? The light changes every day. And sometimes 5 minutes and 6 minutes in a day. And I always enjoyed some components of that in terms of summertime and climbing mountains at midnight, that kind of thing. But it was really hard spiritually. I found it very difficult because of when I moved to Hawaii, the rhythms here are so steady, and it's almost like the island is calling you to that, really. And so here meditating has been way easier, like just staying with that practice and getting into that rhythm. Now when I travel, if I go places that don't have that, I feel that intensely, and I kind of find myself wanting to get back to the island so I can just kind of settle in. That's interesting.
And I think we have so much to learn at this moment in time. Many of us from the Christian household are aware that we need to learn so much from other traditions, and the native traditions have been so wise and so consistent about inviting us to pay attention to the elements of earth, air, fire, and water, or to pay attention to the directions of north, south, east, and west. And these are profoundly simple and natural ways that we can weave into our spiritual practices, and an awareness of the seasons as well.
Seth, do you have any other kind of final questions or thoughts?
Are you kidding? Seth always has more.
I know. And we could go for days. Yeah,
I can go for days. Yeah.
I get to see this guy in a couple of weeks. I'm going to Seattle to catch a baseball game, and it's going to be nice. Yeah.
Oh, great. Great.
No, on a personal level, just the chance to spend some time with you is always cherished. The last time I actually got to spend some time with you, we had breakfast in Seattle when you came and spoke, and just wanted to say thank you for that. I hope to come visit you. I was actually planning my own personal pilgrimage I was going to do, but COVID, the way COVID's going, I've kind of been putting it off and waiting for that experience to settle. But I was going to come to Iona and come through Edinburgh and knock on your door and see if you were there.
Good. I hoop you will.
He's probably taking a nap though. You know, you're like,
Well, and I discovered at the schools of Celtic consciousness, I remember going, wow, he's very serious about these naps. Like this, the naps are very, and the way he would speak about it, it was like everybody knew, like, don't bother him. But then it's funny because that's become a part of my rhythm. And I do, being that I spend 5 to 6 hours a day working with people in their trauma. So that's what I do professionally now. I just work with people, and it's a pretty mystical experience at times, but I have these energies running through me, and that's become a very important part. Almost like my dream world, my meditation world, and my siesta world all kind of blend together, and it's a very important rhythm for me as well.
That's great. And you've touched on something that is very important, and that is the relationship between meditation and dream life, letting go, siesta. These are all times when we're letting go of the conscious and the rational, and that's not to belittle the conscious and the rational. I prize those faculties within us, but it's important to find these disciplines of letting go of just operating up at this level, and getting in touch with the heart and with the realm of the imaginal and the dream life. And I think that meditation often takes us to that almost dreamlike state of awareness. And one of the chapters in the new book is about the sacred imagination, and we can only access the imagination most fully, I believe, by letting go of living predominantly or purely in the conscious and rational realm, and opening allowing ourselves to be part of dreaming the way forward, because we're in such a mess, religiously, nationally, ecologically. We're in such a mess. We need to dream the way forward, and part of what it is to be made in the image of God is to be made in the image of the great dreamer, the great imaginer. I love what Thomas Berry says about the universe. Thomas Berry, the eco-theologian, he says, the universe is so amazing, it must have been dreamt into being. And I love that. And then he, very typically of him, prophetically goes on to say, we need to dream the way forward. We need to allow ourselves to imagine new ways of seeing, new ways of relating. And I think the pandemic that we're still in the midst of has been a further prompt to let go of a lot of what we've known and to imagine a new way.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. So here's the last thing for the show that we do. And on the Voyagers, we do this at the end of the episode. I always ask the guest to leave a blessing with the audience, and whatever it is that comes to mind. And is that okay?
Yes, absolutely. I'm a great believer in blessing. And when my father died about 10 years ago, he had a period of quite rapid dementia, and he would often not remember the word that he was looking for, or the phrase, but something that never left him was a prayer of blessing. And in the retirement center that he was in, I would see him saying to his table companions, "Now, excuse me, I need to bless the people now." And he would go from table to table around the dining hall where there may be about 100 people, and he would visit every table, and he would give them the priestly blessing. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you. That one. And it was so beautiful to see him knowing the power of blessing was still flowing through him, even though so much was being lost in his mind and other faculties. But it was also interesting to see the people at the tables, because people love being blessed, of course. It's something we can do for one another. So there's a blessing I love. It comes from the Western Isles of Scotland, and it profoundly makes the link between the sacredness of the earth and the world of well-being. So I'd like to say these ancient words from the Scottish Highlands, and that is a prayer of deep peace. Deep peace of the running wave to you. Deep peace of the flowing air to you. Deep peace of the quiet earth to you. Deep peace of the shining stars to you. Deep peace of the Son of Peace to you. Amen.
I'll just leave it at that.
JP, thank you.
So good to be with you, and let's make it in person sometime, somewhere.
Yes. Yeah,
I think so.
I'll be a wanderer through your town, and I think our great grandparents, I think, are buried there in Edinburgh.
Well, no, they're up there actually in Perthshire. They're north just a bit. They're up by Dunblane. Yeah, I found them up there. Yeah.
Great.
So we're actually mostly like Scottish, it turns out, from both sides. So, but yeah, we have some families from down in Galloway region. There's some of our roots there, but a lot of it's just in Perthshire area. So,
well, that explains why both of you are slightly crazy.
Just a little bit.
Just a little bit.
Sir, thank you so much for your time, sir. It was a
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
All right, JP. Bye.